Okay, well, let me pray. We'll get going. It shouldn't be a super long class today, but interesting stuff, I think. So we'll get going on. Okay, Lord, thank you for just your kindness to us. Lord, thank you for your word and just the promise of forgiveness and salvation through Christ. And Lord, it's amazing. It's some sentences in a book, but Lord, it's our whole hope and our life. And so Lord, we're so thankful for it. Lord, help us to just use this time now to grow in our ability to exegete and to analyze and to understand the things that you've told us. And Lord, pray that would bring honor and glory to you. Lord, we love you. We thank you for your Son. In his name, amen. All right, so... Oh. Okay, sorry. Okay, so how many of you read chapter 8? Good. Was it interesting? Yes? How many of you did not read chapter 8? Appreciate that honesty. Come on in. Thanks. Sweet. Chap brought me a taco. Okay, so chapter 8 is about context. Okay, now you may or may not have heard this, but like the statement "context is king." Have you ever heard that before? Context is everything, right? So in real estate, they say, what's the three most important things about real estate? Location. Exactly. Handout's right there. Exactly. Location. Everyone says location is the most important thing. Well, in biblical interpretation, the first three important things are context, context, context. We say that all the time. Okay? So when we talk about the context of a text, it's incredibly important. Why? Why is context so important? Or why might context be so important? He actually says this in the book. If you take a text out of its context, what can you do? Totally misinterpret it. Change the whole meaning. You can make it mean whatever you want it to mean, right? A text without a context is a pretext. That's what we like to say. So, very dangerous, right? You take something out of its context, you're going to end up with an interpretation that isn't accurate, and an inaccurate interpretation you can make to mean anything you want it to mean. So it's super tricky, super dangerous to do that, okay? So when we talk about context, there's actually a sentence in the last section of the book, the very last paragraph, when he's giving a conclusion, and I put it in the notes because it's so important if you didn't read. But at the very last paragraph, he says, we study literary context because the interpretation that best fits the context is the most valid interpretation. Oh, did you guys get handouts? Handouts in the back? Okay, good. Is the most valid interpretation. When we disregard the literary context, we run the risk of forcing the Bible to say what we want it to say. Now, he says it's a risk to make the Bible say what you want it to say. How many of you have ever read a verse and you're like, oh, I'm convicted by that. I wish it didn't say that. Yes, many times, right? And yet, what he's telling us is the best thing for us is to hear what handouts back. Hear what it is that God wants us to understand, right? So we need to hear from God, and that is sometimes going to be convicting to us, but that's okay. Like, it's better for us to be convicted. There's a risk that we not actually hear what the text is telling us. Handouts from the back, Josh. Sorry. Oh, very good. Transfer of all the gear. Perfect. I'm not even going to start because Chris Fuller's about to walk in. Chris, handouts are in the back. Perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so does that make sense? That's what we actually want. We want God to speak to us because we're believers and the Spirit of God dwells in us. And we want to change, we want to grow to be more like Him. So how's that going to happen? Well, He's going to speak to us through the Word so that we are changed. We're moved toward Christ-likeness. Okay? If we allow it to say whatever we want it to mean, then we won't actually change. Nothing will move inside of us and we'll just be the way we are. Right? And I'm assuming you want to change. How many of you want to change? Raise your hand if you want to change. Good. So the Bible speaks to us so that we change, so that we move and become more like Christ. That's what we want to do. And when we don't take it in its context, we run the risk of not having God speak to us clearly. Okay? Make sense? Good. Okay, so this is incredibly important, actually. I mean, if you think like, when am I going to use this? Every morning when you read your Bible, right? You get up to read your Bible, you're reading a text in its context. Okay? If you read something outside of its context, as we talked about extensively, that will cause confusion in understanding what the text is saying. Okay? Okay, so in a sense, first bullet point there, this chapter is the peak of all that has come before, right? By carefully analyzing sentences, paragraphs, and discourses, and by divesting ourselves of our preconceived notions. Remember last week, we want to come to the text with as clear blank slate as we possibly can when we come to it without our preconceived notions. We can begin to grasp the author's intent at the level of argument. Okay, now this is important. We're asking ourselves, why? What's happening here? What's happening in the argument of the text itself, right? And the most important principle at the core of all interpretation is context. Okay? And Duval and Hayes give us a helpful framework to consider how to evaluate the literary context of any passage by framing the context in terms of genre and surrounding context. Those are the two categories that we're going to talk about. Okay? Genre. How many of you remember genre from like 8th grade lit class? I don't know. What is genre besides a French word that's very difficult to say? It's easy to say? I don't know. Or genre? I don't know. N's and R's don't usually fit together. Genre. I don't know. Anyway. Yeah. Genre. See? Okay, so that's clearly some French training. I sound like a monkey. But anyway, what is genre? What is it? Yeah. Style of writing. Yeah. Type or theme or style of writing. A means of communication, right? Genre is important because it provides a framework through which we can seek the author's intention. Now again, what's our main goal of all biblical interpretation? Author's intent. Like that's the key, right? We're always seeking the authorial intent all the time. That's our goal, right? And genre provides a framework through which we can access greater levels of the author's intent in what's being communicated to us. Okay? All right, so they explain that the genre functions, Duval and Hayes explain that the genre functions as a kind of covenant of communication between the author and reader. Such an important statement, right? That's an incredibly important statement. The genre is a covenant of communication between the author and reader. What's the covenant that's being made? I'm writing in this way. Please read it in that way, right? There's an agreement that's being made. And as a reader, we come and we want to uphold our end of that bargain, right? The author is saying, hey, please read this in this fashion. We're receiving it, and we say, okay, I'll read it in the fashion that you intended it to be, right? You can think of where genre could get you in trouble. We talked about this early, right? If you're writing a love letter, right, to your future spouse, James, and you put it in the mailbox, and the mailman opens it, and he reads it. Right, exactly. Yeah, so it causes confusion, right? So we want to be cautious about those genres and how they're being used, okay? All right, so let's look at some of these. The author has constructed the communication with certain built-in rules for interpretation. So let's look at some wisdom literature texts, okay? This is one genre, which is wisdom literature texts. Look at Proverbs 22:6. Look at Proverbs 22:6, okay? We're going to look at some specific examples of where this covenant communication is important. Someone, when you get there, read it out loud. This is an interesting verse.
Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Okay, what does that sound like Solomon is saying?
Your kid is saved.
Yes, exactly. Raise your kid right, and your kids will be saved. Right? That's literally what it sounds like he's saying. But is that what he's saying? Is he making a promise? No. Okay, this is not a promise. This is wisdom literature. So what's the wisdom that's contained in that statement? What's actually being communicated there?
Children are creatures of habit.
Yeah, children are creatures of habit. And when you train them, God generally blesses the training that you've provided so that they more or less will follow after those things. He's not talking about salvation. He's talking about the general patterns of life that they learn in, right? They learn to grow in certain general patterns of life. That's all he's saying. It's not a promise. And he's not even saying that always happens. He's just saying this is a general principle, a general maxim that you can follow. So train up a child well, do the best job you can with training your kids, and hopefully they'll follow after the things that you've trained them in, right? Does that make sense? So we can't read that verse and say, well, that's a promise to me, right? All my kids will be Christians. That's what I should expect. Well, no, I can't know that, right? All I can know is that God has his choice in who he chooses to save, and I can trust him that he's good in that. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so it's a wisdom literature text. Now, that's on the positive side. That sounds very positive, right? Train up a child in the way he will go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. Then you have Ecclesiastes. What's Ecclesiastes? It's like angry Song of Solomon. I mean, angry Solomon, right? What does he do in Ecclesiastes? He says like harsh stuff. Look at Ecclesiastes 6:8. This is fun. Someone read it out loud when you get it.
What advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have knowing how to walk before living?
Okay. Is there any advantage to being wise over being foolish? Duh. Right? Of course there is, right? There's all sorts of advantages. But this is Solomon when he's like, well, nothing really matters. That's literally what he's saying, right? Well, there's wisdom that's contained in that. What is he actually saying if you read the context of it? He's saying, at the end of the day, all of us are going to die, right? It's not like you're going to, it's not like you can escape that because you're wise. So in the context, you have clarity on what he means, but that's wisdom literature, right? That's a wisdom literature. In fact, even before that, in verse 3, it says, if a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they may be, but his soul is not satisfied with the good things that he does not even, that he does, not even have a proper burial, then I say, better the miscarriage than he, right? So you have like very interesting language that's coming out of Solomon there. Well, why? Well, because in the covenant of communication that he's made with us, this is an expose of life. That's what he's doing, right? And so it's wise in the sense of communicating to us that really life is futile apart from obeying God and trusting him. Does that make sense? So again, we have covenants of communication. One more, Song of Solomon. Okay, how many of you have read Song of Solomon? Okay. How many of you remember the descriptions of the wife? Right, like your nose is like a tower, and your teeth are like sheep. Okay, is that literal? Like she might have had woolly teeth. I don't know if they had toothbrushes, but I mean, it's not literal. What's he doing? He's expressing her beauty in ways that make sense to an ancient Near Eastern king, right? So he's just like, he's praising his wife that in ways that make sense to an ancient Near Eastern king. But what's the genre of Song of Solomon? Poetry. It's wisdom poetry, right? And he's expressing covenant love between a husband and a wife. That's a genre. So he's allowed to do that, and we don't have to be like, well, I wonder if she actually had teeth that were sheep. I mean, we don't have to do that because we know he's expressing something that's poetic and beautiful as he communicates to his bride, right? So again, covenant of communication. The way the author has written it is the way that we should accept it. Good? So wisdom. Okay, second one, narrative. What is a narrative? What kind of a genre is narrative? Yeah, storytelling. You're just telling the story of something that happened, right? We know narrative. That's really the way that we are. We live by narrative, right? Most conversations end up in a story. I remember one time, and you end up in a story, right? So we understand narrative communication. That's the way that we communicate in our society, okay? But that's not just us. Most societies communicate with narrative. What are some parts of the Bible that are narrative? The Gospels are narrative, good. What else? The history books, good. 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, those are narrative. It's descriptive, right? What else? There's more. Yeah, parts of the Pentateuch are. Yeah, the Pentateuch is tricky. We're going to come to that in a minute because it's like narrative, command. It just goes in and out of all sorts of different things, right? What else? And poetry. It's narrative, and then you have the Song of Moses, and you're like, drop off this cliff, and you're like, oh, we're in poetry now. Woo! It's just, you don't expect that, right? Good. What else is narrative? Ruth, good. Ruth is narrative, and also instructive, right, at the end. What else is narrative? Esther is narrative, good. Those are historical books. Good. What else? Yeah, the Gospels. Yeah, House of the Gospels. What else? Someone said it. Acts. Acts is actually narrative, right? It's just the story of Paul and Peter and their ministry, right? And the transition between Peter and Paul. Now, is all of Acts narrative? Think for a minute. Is all of Acts narrative? No. Why not? Exactly. What part of Acts is not narrative? There's some portions that are not. Think about it. Think super hard. Do you remember the book of Acts? What about Acts 15? What happens in Acts 15? You have the Jerusalem Council over what Jews and Gentiles can do. And what is contained in Acts 15? A letter. So James writes a letter to the churches, and in the course of the narrative, it says, now the letter said this. Boom. Now, are you in the same genre now? No, now you're in an epistolary genre, right? A letter, the way that Paul writes letters, the way that we're studying the book of Romans is the same thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, and boom, they sent the letter and you go back into narrative again, right? So those genres can shift as you move through text, okay? All right, so here's an example of this. We have to be careful to analyze the language in the wider context. So look at Mark 10, 41 through 46. Okay, so Mark 10, 41 to 46. Let's start in 41 through 45. What is Jesus saying? He calls them to himself, and he said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not to be this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall become your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Is that prescriptive or descriptive? You understand the difference? Go ahead, John.
It's like a description of a prescription.
Good, yeah. He's describing himself, right? Jesus says, I didn't come to be served. But in describing himself, he's actually giving teeth to the prescription, what we ought to do, right? What we should be like. Does that make sense? So you have a prescription, what you should be like, which is you should be a servant, right? If you want to be great, be a servant, be the slave of all. Now look at verse 46. Then they came to Jericho. Okay. Is the way to be a servant to go to Jericho? Any of you been to Jericho? No. What happened between verse 45 and 46? You have a change of genre, right? You have a statement from Christ, which is prescriptive, and a shift in genre that then provides a new set of narrative descriptions. Okay? Does that make sense? So we want to watch for those. I think we do this naturally, actually. We do this naturally just in our reading. We just read, it just makes sense to us. We have to be cautious. Okay? Good? Good. Okay, prophecy. Prophets used figurative language. However, when studying this genre, we must allow the author to tell us when something is figurative, right? Why is this so important? Someone think about it. Why would it be important? A prophet says something. Okay, let's try this. Look at Ezekiel Chapter 1, just for funsies. Turn back there. Hopefully wake you up. It's warm in here. Everyone's a little tired. Ezekiel Chapter 1. How many of you have read Ezekiel Chapter 1 before? Okay. Now, is this figurative language or is it narrative, description of something that happened to him? It's narrative. How do we know that? Good, yeah, good. And so in the context, we know he's saying, I actually saw this, right? And he uses language that tells us that it's not figurative language at all, right? Look at verse 15. Look what he says. Now as I what? Looked. So he's saying, I'm looking at something, and this is what's actually happening in front of me. He describes it in ways that are figurative, right? What are some of the figurative ways that he describes it? Where do you see figures of or statements that seem figurative? We looked at this last time. See any figurative language? Yeah, good. Yeah, language like, it was like this, it was like that, it looked like this, it was like this, it had this, it looked like this. That's figurative, or sounds figurative, but he's actually describing something, okay? Which is super important. When the prophets use language, what should we do with that language? We have to hear it as literal. And if it's meant to be taken figuratively, the author will tell us that it's meant to be taken figuratively. Does that make sense? Okay, let's look at why this is so important. This drastically affects your hermeneutics and implications. Look at Ezekiel chapter 40. Flip forward a little bit. Ezekiel chapter 40. Okay, start in verse 1. What does he say? In the 25th year of our exile, we have a date, right? We have a date, and he's telling us something, okay? In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year, after the city was taken, on that same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there. Where? Well, he tells us, in the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, and on it to the south, there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there, right? Now, figurative or real? It's in the visions, but he's seeing something, right? God took me somewhere. Does that make sense? Everything after this is the description of a temple. Will this temple someday exist? Yeah. How do we know? Because Ezekiel says, I was actually there. He brought me there. There's a location. On this date, he brought me there. I saw it. This is what I was seeing. For us to say, well, that's just figurative, is arrogant, right? That's super arrogant for us to say that. Does that make sense? We don't want to step on the author's intention. Good? Okay, good. That's prophecy. Last one, epistles, right? Look at Romans chapter 16. Romans chapter 16. Verse 6. We'll get here eventually. What does he say? Okay. That's in the imperative. So what are we supposed to do? Greet every Mary we run into? Your name's Mary? Greetings. I've been commanded to do this by the Apostle Paul, right? No. Why? Why would we make that evaluation and say, no, that command isn't actually for me? Because why? He's writing it in a what? In a letter, right? So the genre governs the way that we think about the language that's being used. And in the case of a letter, when he greets people that are in the city that he's writing to, that's great, right? We're totally comfortable with him doing that. If I walked around and started greeting every Mary in the name of God, people would be like, ooh, cult, right? Because that's odd. Why? Because I'm applying something that isn't actually meant for me to apply. But the genre tells me that. It informs me. Now, there are other texts in Romans where there's a command, right? And those commands are for me. So we can distinguish those two. How do we know that one command is for me and one command isn't? Because it's a letter, right? So the genre identifies that for me. It helps me make those decisions. Does that make sense?
I guess the thing that I'm a little confused is the narrative versus prophecy.
Yeah.
Like
Good.
In the text about the vision.
Yeah.
Now, I always see that as prophecy. It's not narrative.
So Ezekiel was a prophet, but in that context, he's actually narrating what took place for him. So he actually experienced that reality, right? So both are happening at the same time in one sense. But as a prophet, he's functionally telling us what took place when he saw that vision of God. In Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48, he's saying, God took me in a vision to this thing, and this is what I saw. And there he's functioning as a prophet. He's looking at something, and God is saying, write this down because you're now communicating for me what will come in the future. So narrative and prophecy, they're up against each other again.
Is it significant to differentiate those two?
Absolutely significant. Super significant. Yeah. Because what he's seeing in chapter 1 is a vision, but it's a vision of something that's actually happening at that moment. He's actually seeing that in that moment. What happens to him in Ezekiel 40 through 48 is a vision of something that's coming in the future, and he says, God took me into this place, I saw this vision, and this is what I saw when I was there. So very important in terms of interpretive grids of understanding both. Yeah. One's more narrative, one is narrative, and the other is prophetic. Good, very good. Any other questions on genre? Isn't this so exciting? We'll take a break and get a drink of water, maybe. Yes?
How far back have debates over books like Jonah been taking place? Was the early church arguing about, specifically, ones that are not incredibly blatantly wrong?
What do you mean? What?
I mean, I think Jonah's blatantly wrong to take as not narrative.
Right.
But you have a lot of modern guys that do.
Yeah, I'd say it's not narrative. Yeah.
How far back has that been going on, specifically for Jonah?
Yeah. For Jonah, you really have the debates. Most of those form critical evaluations started in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century in Germany. Prior to that,
Criticism
higher criticism stuff. Prior to that, there were discussions of that, but it's mostly like, those guys are mostly like, defrocked or removed from ministry or those kinds of things. If you say like, oh, Jonah wasn't real, prior to 1700, if you said that, even in Europe, you were essentially like labeled an atheist. They assumed the Bible was true, and then they tried to evaluate things based on that. Yeah. The higher criticism stuff that happened in Germany in the 19th century, they basically started that process. So there's a guy named Wellhausen. Anyway, you'll learn all about that. It'll be great. You'll love every minute of it. Super fun. Anyway, those those debates start really like in the last 250 years, 300 years, at the earliest. Prior to that, people just assumed either I accept the Bible and it's true, or I reject it and I'm an atheist. But there weren't people who were like, I accept the Bible, I just don't think any of it's true. That doesn't happen prior to that. In any kind of substantial way. Yeah, people did that, but they were labeled heretics. So, yeah. Good. Okay, any questions on genre? Everyone awake? All right, let's do this. Let's all stand up real quickly. How many of you had a nice large lunch? Yes, good. Nice large lunch, and then you walk into hermeneutics and we're discussing genre, French words, right? That just makes you want to go to sleep. So everyone stand up, stretch. Isn't that nice? We don't have the air conditioning on in here, so it's warm, beautiful. It's a great day. When I look out and even my own children are dozing, we know we have to... Sarah's eyes glass over. She's like this. Blackbeard the pirate can sleep with his eyes open. That's all I'm going to say. All right, you can sit back down again. You can keep standing if you'd like. It's totally fine. Okay, so second half is the surrounding context, okay? The surrounding context. That's awesome. True. Never trust the Germans, I'm telling you. Yep. I've never met a German I can trust. I'm just teasing. Yes, you are, aren't you? Canadian. Norwegian? Is it really? I thought it was German. Oh. Oh, really? Oh, there you go. Vikings. I was going to say, they're not trustworthy either. There's a way I can make this work. Yeah, crazy Aryans with swords. Okay, so surrounding context, that's what we're going to look at, okay? The surrounding context. Really, everything we've done in class up to this point is to gain a stronger grasp of this idea. The authors lay out 3 specific ways that we can evaluate the surrounding context for our passage. Super important, okay? Super, super important when you're reading the Bible. You've got to evaluate the surrounding context, okay? And they tell us 3 ways that we can do this. This is helpful, I think. We can sort of categorize these, and we're going to try to make them a little more robust than they were in the book. The first way to identify the surrounding context, or to understand the surrounding context, is to identify how the book is divided into paragraphs or sections. Okay? Now, if you remember in the book, if you read the book, what book does he do this with? Philemon. He breaks down Philemon into categories, right? And you remember that chart in the book? There was a chart in the book if you didn't read it. And it has different translations and where they break the paragraphs. The King James just has like 3 paragraphs. Like intro, prayer, bleh, right? That's it. And then other translations have more paragraphs, lots of paragraphs. The CSB, I think, had the most. So all sorts of paragraph breaks inside there. Why do we have to do that? Why do we have different translations that have different paragraphs? Yeah, we're trying to categorize thoughts together. Why do we have to try to categorize those thoughts together? Paragraphs didn't exist, right? In fact, punctuation didn't exist. If you see the text of like the old codices of the New Testament, it's just capital letters written in lines. That's it. So they just read without punctuation, without paragraph breaks. You just read, right? And it's all just written out. So they could do that because it's a highly inflected language. They had the ability to do that. We don't have the ability to do that. So we have to figure out where paragraph breaks come, okay? And they provide a set of criteria for evaluating breaks in thought. I think these are helpful, but they're not always certain, okay? They're not always certain, but they're helpful. Conjunctions. Anyone remember conjunction, junction, what's your function? Good. If you don't, get on YouTube and type in conjunction junction. It'll help you tons. Huh? I'm just a Bill on Capitol Hill. Same guys. Good. Yes. Good. Schoolhouse Rock. Yeah, not School of Rock. Nope. Okay, we have conjunctions. Look at Ephesians Chapter 2. You guys know these conjunctions, right? You know these conjunctions. Ephesians 2. What's Ephesians 2, 1 through 3? Yeah, the bad news. We have the bad news, Ephesians 1, 1 through 3, and then we have a transition. How do we know there's a transition in verse 4? But God, right? So we have a break in thought. So we have the bad news, then we have a break in thought, verse 4. Then where's our next break in thought? Verse what? Well, yeah, kind of, but it's a so that. That's connected. 11. What's the word in 11? Therefore. So you have the bad news, the good news, and from 4 to 10. What? James? Pierce? Yeah, James is over here. Pierce is over here. Sorry. Yeah. Verse 11, the therefore, right? So we have the bad news, the good news, and then the what? What comes in verse 11? The therefore. The commands, the beginning of the explanation of what that gospel means for us as Gentiles, right? So he's now going to draw that out into a deeper understanding of what the gospel means for us as Gentiles. Does that make sense? So we're catching the change in thought that Paul's making. So if I want to understand what Paul's saying, if I just read it straight through, I'm like, but I don't know what it's all saying. Those tags help me to understand where the breaks are. Okay?
And those are not words that the translator inserted.
No, that's Paul's language. Yeah. Paul put the word therefore in there. Yeah. He put the word but. It's the strongest adversative in Greek, right? What? Everyone's a sinner, but God, right? The strongest adversative in Greek. He put it in there, and he put it in there for a purpose, so that we could see the change that happens in us. Okay? Good? So that's one way of seeing a change in thought. Okay? What about a change of genre? We already talked about these. Change of genre. It shows us a change in thought, right? So if there's a change from narrative to prophecy to didactic teaching, you're seeing changes that tells you, oh, there's a break in thought here. I need to notice that break in thought. Look at Matthew 13 and count. This is a fun little exercise. Count how many changes of genre you can find in Matthew 13. Okay? And when I say fun, fun for nerds, but really fun. Look at Matthew 13. Okay? See how many changes of genre you can find. I'm going to eat my taco.
Is the answer a lot?
Yes. The answer is many, many. Yeah, like just look for a few. You don't even have to go all the way through them. Where do you see the first one? Yeah, what happens in verse 3? Yeah, he begins a parable, right? So now you have actual language. He's teaching. Okay, so prior to that we had what? Narrative, description of events. Okay, so we have description of events, then we have teaching. What else? What happens in verse 10? Back to narrative. Okay, keep going. It kind of gets lumped in with the parable. Yeah, it's like the conclusion to the parable. Good question, though, Josh. Thank you. Very, very insightful. Okay, where else do we see another change? Yeah, what happens in 14? Yeah, so he's now quoting Old Testament prophecy. Okay, good. Then he shifts back again, verse 16, right? What happens in verse 18? Another parable. Okay? Well, not a parable, but in this case, the explanation of a parable. So you have a portion of didactic teaching where he's explaining what's taking place, right? So you have actual dialogue happening. Okay? Yeah.
How many types of genre do you usually interact with when reading the Bible?
A lot. But I think there's 6 or 8 maybe. It's not a ton, but it just bounces back and forth. You get, in these texts it does for sure. And then we go to another parable, right? Verse 24, another parable pops up. Then verse 31, then verse 33, then verse 36. Okay? Then we have, at the end of, in verse 41, we have prophecy, right? So he explains the parable and it's prophetic. So now you have a prophetic genre shift. Then we have 44, 45, back again into those, 47 again. 53, what happens? Actually, 51, what happens at 51? That's a question. We're back to a dialogue, right? And we're back into the narrative again. 53, narrative again, right? Back to dialogue. So we're bouncing all over the place. And what's happening at each one of those bounces in your Bible? What do you notice? Paragraph changes, right? The author, the translators are like, new thought, new thought, new thought, and they're breaking it up for us so that we can see thoughts are changing. There's a progression of thought that's taking place through those things. Good? Make sense? Okay, so if there's conjunctions, they can sometimes be a change in thought or a change in paragraph. Change in genre often is. Okay, number 3, changes of topic or theme. Okay, an author can indicate shift in topic or shift in theme through many different ways. One of them is an indicator, right, which is language. Language is a good indicator. When you're reading 1 Corinthians, you don't have to look it up, but in 1 Corinthians, watch for Paul to say, now concerning. Okay, what happens? Well, what Paul's doing when he says now concerning is picking up a new topic that he's heard they're having a problem with. Okay? So he gets wind from Chloe's people that there's problems in Corinth. And so there's a letter that they end up bringing with Chloe, and that's who carries this letter. Paul reads the letter, and he's like, everything is chaos. So he writes back to them, and deals with the points that they've referenced in the letter. And every time he picks up a new point, he says, now concerning, and now concerning this, now concerning that, now concerning this, and now concerning that. And he does it a whole bunch. It's all the way through the book, okay? So we can just pick those things up and say, oh, that's a new idea, new thought, new thought, new thought. And that is a signal for us that the context is changing, okay? Good? Good. Okay, 4th one, changes in time, location, and setting, right? Prophets often wrote with shifts between prophecy and narrative. For example, Isaiah 6:1. What happens in Isaiah 6:1? Do you guys remember? Yeah, it's a vision of the Lord high and lifted up. Prior to that, chapter 5 is prophetic. 6:1, narrative. Now, Isaiah's going to have a vision, and he's going to pick up again at the end of chapter 6 and pick up back into prophecy. Okay? Good. Okay, and then changes in grammar. Linguistic changes that can signal a shift in the author's intent. We've covered lots of these in previous lessons, right? If you hear the grammar change or something shifts in the language, past tense, future tense, those kinds of things, you're seeing a shift in the context, okay? So that's one way to identify separation of context. Good? Good, okay. Number 2, another way, right? We can summarize the main, or the next step, okay? Summarize the main idea of each section. Okay, you're trying to understand the general context of something. You break it into its pieces, right? You break it into the pieces that you want it to understand, and then you summarize each one of those pieces. Yes?
So then what's a section talking about on different sides of text?
So a section, like for example in Matthew 13, what is a section in Matthew 13? Yeah. Oh, what do you guys think a section is in Matthew 13? What's our context? Yeah. So we're starting in thought blocks, right? And we take those thought blocks and we summarize each thought block and we string them together. And that gives us the context of one thought block. Does that make sense? Yeah? No? Okay, so let's look at Matthew 13, right? Just Matthew 13, we'll look there real quickly. He says, Jesus teaches in parables, okay? That's the heading of this chapter, right? So you have one big section that's all parables. So how do we understand, like, for example, pick a parable like the hidden treasure, verse 44. Okay? The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. How do I understand that parable? Like, I could make something up right now that sounded fairly decent, right? Since the kingdom of heaven is a treasure that's hidden in a field, then you should sell everything that you have and give it to FPC. Because you will find treasures in heaven. Good interpretation or not a good interpretation? It's good for me. Thanks, Jen. It's good for me, right? But that's not a good interpretation of that verse. Why? Well, because of the context around it, right? We could make something up, but the context around it tells me that there's something much bigger at play here, right? And what's the bigger thing? Well, the bigger thing is the kingdom. Well, what is the kingdom? Well, the kingdom ultimately is Christ and all that's coming in the future. Does that make sense? So to understand that parable, I have to unpack each of those sections coming out from that parable and understand the general context of it. Does that make sense? So I have to understand each piece, and then I string all the pieces together, and I understand the meaning of that one piece as I move through the text. Yes? Does that make sense? Good. Okay. All right, so we want to summarize the main idea of each section. This step is crucial. We need to perform sentence, paragraph, and discourse level analysis in order to gain a comprehensive understanding of a given section before seeking to build the author's argument from the context. Super important. You got to understand each section independently before you try to understand the author's ultimate point, his umbrella idea. Okay? If we want to understand the umbrella idea, it works from the bottom up. We analyze each verse, each section itself, each verse, each sentence, each paragraph, each discourse itself. Those feed into the author's intent. Okay? I can say Christ's intent or Matthew's intent is to tell you to give all your money to the local church. And that's why he writes this in verse 44 of Matthew 13. So sell everything you have and give it to me. Right? But that's not what Matthew's trying to do. So if I try to build the author's intent without first understanding the specifics of the context, I will do violence to the text. Okay? So that's top down, right? You can imagine that kind of top down thinking, right? My theology tells me this, therefore this verse means this. That's dangerous. We want to go the other way, bottom up. Doesn't matter what my theology thinks, what does this verse say? If this verse says something, I want that verse to speak for itself. Then I'm from the verses, as I link the verses together, I'm going to build a theology out of that. Does that make sense? I want to let the text build the net of my understanding of Scripture, not let my net and understanding of Scripture read into the text. Okay? Super important when you're studying the Bible. Okay? So here's an example from Ezekiel. Okay? Nothing personal, Pierce. People say that whole section, 8 chapters of Ezekiel, we say it's the description of a temple, right? He describes a temple, he measures it, he's like, oh, it's this far over here and this far over here and all these things. But I heard a sermon not that long ago from a guy, and he said, Jesus said what about the temple? What did Jesus say about the temple? Destroy this temple, and in what? 3 days I will build it back up again. What did Jesus call himself there? A temple. Jesus called himself a temple. Ezekiel describes a temple. What was Ezekiel describing? Jesus. Duh. But that's bad hermeneutics, right? What am I doing? I have a grid that I've built over here from a right interpretation of this text, and I take that grid and I walk over to Ezekiel and I'm like, it must mean that, right? I actually heard a guy, great scholar, super good biblical scholar in the New Testament, and he preached a sermon on all of Ezekiel 40 to 48, and he was like, well, the temple's Jesus. There's a lot of specificity here because God is a God of specificity and he likes order. Anyway, that's the best I can do with this. And I was like, wow, you can't say that. That's terrible, right? What's happening? That's top-down interpretation of text, right? We want to deal with the passage and then work upward. So if Ezekiel says he saw a temple, I'm going to take that as a temple. I'm not going to try to read the New Testament into that text. I'm going to take it as a temple and then seek to understand how that fits into a wider theological understanding. Does that make sense? That distinction is super critical. We have to learn to think bottom up and not top down. We tend to all think top down because we come to something and we already have a grid in our minds of how we should read that text. And so we come to any text and we're like, well, I'm just going to read this the way I understand it. But we have to force ourselves to say, no, even though my theology says this, I'm going to start at the bottom and work upward into the theology and make things fit into my theology. And if that means my theology has to change, that's okay, right? I'll be a dispensationalist if I have to. Because that's what that verse says. Okay, good. I tease Pierce because it's fun. Okay, good. All right, look at 1 Corinthians 18 through 31. And try to summarize 1 Corinthians 18 through 31 into a single sentence. Okay? Try to summarize it into a single sentence. This one, take a minute and try to do. Okay? See if you can figure it out. 1 Corinthians... 1, 18 through 31. Forgive me. 1 Corinthians 18 through 31. There's only 16 chapters. Sorry. 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 31. See if you can summarize it into a single sentence. Snark. Let me just say this. If you tell me 1 Corinthians. It's kind of hard, huh? Try to get it into a single sentence. Tough. Anyone have one they want to share? John, you want to share yours?
I already talked a lot.
I know. You're doing a great job.
I didn't write one down, but I tried to put one together.
Okay.
In one sentence, I guess I would say like the high wisdom of the world will be brought low, but the wisdom of God, or like will be put to shame, but the wisdom of God builds up and is true wisdom.
Okay.
I don't know.
Good.
I didn't write one down.
You got to write it down. Otherwise, you can't get it all in your head. Seriously, it's super hard to try to just keep it in your head. Anyone else have one? That's good. I mean, that's true. Anyone want to share theirs? Yeah.
Human wisdom is forged in the eye of the Lord.
Okay. Good. Yes. Also true. Very good. What else? There's more in there, obviously. It's hard to get into one sentence, but what else could we say? Yeah.
I have the gospel can only truly be understood through the divine influence of God.
Good. Yeah, that's super helpful. The gospel's got to be part of that, right? So it's true. Human wisdom is one part of that he's talking about. He's talking about divine versus human wisdom, but that is connected to the idea of the gospel, right? Good. Okay, so we got a couple pieces there. What else could we say? Anyone else want to share? Faith, want to share? No. No, you refuse to share? Okay, good. Chris, you want to share?
Similar to what John said, a little bit better. There was a reason for the war.
There was. Someone's just trying to keep the British quiet. Go ahead.
God uses the gospel in a supreme act of wisdom and in such a way to put this on display to foolish and helpless men.
Okay, very good. Yeah, super helpful. It was better than John's. That's good. So gospel, wisdom, display, foolishness, all that stuff's tied in together, right? Anything else? James?
It's not quite as good as Chris's, but
That's all right.
the foolish will never understand the gospel. Those that are truly wise will.
Okay, good. That's like an implication of it, right? The truly wise person actually understands the gospel. That's an implication of the text. Good, very good. Yeah. Kyle, you have one?
It's not on the same level as any of those.
Okay. No, that's fine. Just tell us what it is.
The NASB has it as the wisdom of God. I wrote the wisdom is superior to man's wisdom, or God's wisdom is superior to man's wisdom.
Yeah, basically what John said. Yeah. Yeah.
But more
Yeah. Okay, that's all good. Anyone else? Anyone brave enough to share? Good job. Nice. Chad, are you British?
I will say, it says it's like that we are fools, the world is fools, and we have to admittedly accept that we're fools in order to gain wisdom from God through what He has done. And then, even then, we're still fools.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's good. That's very good. Yeah, there's a component of admission, right? He's saying, we know this is true of this, right? Anyone else have a sentence they want to share? Sam, you got one? No? Okay, that's okay. You don't want to share? That's all right. Chris is kind of a show-off. Anybody else? Anyone else have one they want to share? Or that they feel like is a succinct summary? Now, here's what's tricky about this, okay? We're trying to summarize it. So in a sense, like we could summarize it all the way down, like what Lee said is a true summary of what's there, right? But we want to try to grasp all that text into one handful, right? And to do that, we have to incorporate the gospel, the reality of Christ for us, and that Christ is ultimately our wisdom now, right? The one who has given us righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So all that has to be compressed into one thought, one sentence. Yeah.
So when you're writing these summaries, like how many commas do you want in? Is it a certain point like your summary might be longer than the actual text?
Shouldn't be. That's pretty unhelpful. Yeah, if you have like 27 commas, you don't have to get every single thing. Like for example, we don't have to get every detail in there about like Jews and Greeks and how they feel about Christ and all those things. That's not necessarily crucial to understanding the main idea of that block of text. So we want the main idea. And in this case, the main idea is the word of the cross. It's the gospel, which becomes the wisdom of God, which ultimately puts to shame all human wisdom. Right? That's the main idea. And, comma, you could add a comma at the end, and unites us to Christ, who is all true wisdom. So you could add that at the end if you want. But that's a summary of that statement, right? Basically what Chris said. It was decent. Yeah. Even a blind squirrel is right twice a day. Okay, good. Okay, good. All right, so it's famous for other reasons, which we will not go into at this time. Okay, so do you see why that's so important? You get all that text into one block, and you're helped by that, right? You can go back in chapter 1 before that, and we can take the same thing and condense it again. What's that all about? Well, it's about divisions and Paul's desire that Christ would be at their hearts rather than than human divisions between them in the church. So you have human divisions, the reality of the gospel, making them wiser than the wisest of people on the earth. What's Paul moving toward? He's rebuking them for what? For those divisions and helping them to see how true unity is fostered in the church, right? And that's not because we've read the whole book. That's because we're just giving summaries of each section. Does that make sense? So we're getting the argument that Paul is making. So when we get the argument that Paul makes, then what can we do? Well, you pull a verse out of 1 Corinthians 1, pick a verse out of that section, anywhere. Verse 26, for consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, right? You know why he's saying that now. Why? Because you have this link of important statements that are being made, and you have them all written out in sentence form, so you're able to grab that and say, oh, I know exactly what he's saying when he says that. He's rebuking them, actually. He's saying, you guys are trying to divide over which person you follow and try to act like you're wiser than other people, but you're actually not. God saves the foolish things of the world through the means of the gospel, which should be your unity. Yeah?
When you're actually prepping a sermon, do you have like a big idea statement that you try and cover there? Or is that just like a mental concept that you actually just work on?
No, you always have like one sentence. Yeah, like every week I email Enoch and I say, hey, Enoch, this week the sermon is, and I give him a sentence. And from that sentence, I tell him which verses we're covering and the sentence that should summarize the verses. And then from that sentence, he'll pick songs.
How much do you find, like, how much refinement do you tend to find as the week goes on?
A ton.
Yeah, so you really
Yeah.
one of those things you kind of throw a dart and
Yeah.
the dart gets beat.
Yeah, maybe a little better than a dart. Yeah. Yeah, a little better than a dart usually. But yeah, I mean, anytime we're studying anything, right? When you sit down and read your quiet time, right? How do you know what the text is saying? When you're just going to sit and read your quiet time or you want to understand something, how can you possibly know? Well, you know it by the context. So you're constantly building those things. I talk about context in sermons sometimes. Like, remember when I was like, we walked through them at the beginning at the end of 15:13, and I was like, hey, this is this next section from 14:1 through 15:13. This is this section. Most of you don't remember because you sleep through the sermons, which is fine. But that section is one section. So why do I do that? Well, I'm breaking it off because that section can be summarized in one sentence. And we could summarize the whole book of Romans in one sentence, in one sense. But that's not, we're trying to take pieces. And then as those pieces get smaller, the smaller the pieces get, the more clear it becomes. Make sense? So that way we're staying, as we do our interpretation in this single passage, we're staying within the context that the text is forcing us to. All the time. Yeah.
So you write like summaries for the entire book, and then for like chapter specific, and then for like the actual local.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you have summaries that start global and then they move inward, and which is super helpful, right? Because if you can sit down and like just from off the top of your head outline Romans, that's super helpful. Because you know where he is at any given point. So you're just able to pull a verse out and be like, oh, if I hit verse 5, chapter 5, I know he's talking about justification. I'm good, right? Beginning of chapter 5. If I hit chapter 6, he's going to be talking about sanctification. Or chapter 8, he's talking about life in the Spirit. Because that's the movement that he's making as he walks through those things. So that helps us as we study, as we read our Bibles, to understand what the text is saying, and helps us understand Paul's meaning in those passages. Does that make sense? Good. And anyone can do this. This is not hard to do. This is not like you need a seminary degree to do this. Just sit down with your Bible and read it and say, okay, how can I summarize this in a sentence? Lord, give me wisdom. Help me to summarize this in a sentence. And what you're trying to do when you do that is try to grab it all and get it into one idea that makes sense and covers everything that's there. Okay? Good? It's a great exercise. And it's actually like incredibly helpful for us. If we're going to be teaching any way, any kind, super helpful. And even if you're like, well, I'm never going to be teaching. I don't want to do that. Listen, you still can do this, and it's incredibly important for you because you're seeing the flow of thought, and that makes it easy to apply. Okay? Good? Okay. All right, last one. Number 3. Then we'll do a couple quick examples. Okay? Lastly, so you look for breaks. Once you identify the breaks, then you summarize each section with a sentence, right? And the third piece is you explain how your passage relates to the surrounding sections. Right? So that's all we're doing is tying it to the rest of the book, to the wider context. Okay, so the final stop is to identify how the specific text you're dealing with relates to the wider body of the work as a whole. Certain passages can be single components of a larger argument and are therefore serving the larger context. For example, Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3:14 through 19 provide a succinct summary of what has come before and a basis for his doxology and commands which come after. Right? So that's just one example. This prayer in Ephesians 3:14 to 19. It's just a prayer, but what's actually happening there in terms of his argument? Well, it's producing the doxology, the praise, and then it's giving power for all the stuff that comes after that, the commands. And it's a summary of what's come before, which is really just the gospel. Okay? Okay, and then other passages are central to understanding the author's entire argument and must be understood before an interpretation or authorial intent can even be attempted. Before you can ever understand the authorial intent of the book of John, what passage do you have to read? Yes, not 21. 20, 30, and 31. Look at John 20, 30, and 31. Super important. If you just open the book of John, you start reading, you might get the point. But John likes to drop the bombs at the end, right? And almost the very last thing that he says is actually incredibly helpful. I mean, they're all helpful. It's all helpful, but it's helpful in understanding his point. Someone read that for me. John 20, 30 through 31.
Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. These are written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name.
Okay, what just happened there? The purpose of what? Of the whole book. Now that's an amazing statement, because what John is actually telling us is, this is why I wrote this. So when you go back to chapter 1, verse 1, and you're going to start interpreting through the book of John, what should you have in mind all the time? He's writing this for faith, right? He wants me to believe. Everything that I look at in the book of John is designed to push me toward believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's what he's wanting me to get at. So every piece of it has to be interpreted within that framework, right? Does that make sense? There's a bunch of these. John's terrible because he always puts them at the end. Not terrible, he's great, but he always puts them at the end. Look at 1 John chapter 5. This one's another one. 1 John chapter 5. You probably have seen this one before, and maybe it's made you trip up a little bit. Verse 21. Someone read that. Okay, is that how you would normally end a letter? I wouldn't. Why does he do that? What's he doing there? He's actually telling us the purpose of the book, right? He wants us to worship the true and living Christ. And he knows that idols will get in the way and take us away from that. And some of those idols might be, in the case of 1 John, a heretical doctrine like Gnosticism, right? So he says, keep yourselves from idols. Stay away from those things and worship the true and living Christ. That's what he's actually doing in the entire book, is calling for us to worship Christ and showing what true worship of Christ looks like from the heart. So every category in John is actually designed to move toward that end, to drive us toward worship of him. Does that make sense? Okay, one more just for funsies. Look at 1 Timothy. I don't know, I think it's funsy. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 1. And verse 5. What does this give us? It's not rocket science, no offense, Fuller. What is he telling us here? The purpose. The goal of our instruction is what? Love. Okay? So everything that Paul's going to write in 1 Timothy is centered around what? Love, right? And so everything he's doing is saying, I want to have clean conscience, right? All this purity that he wants to produce. He's telling Timothy how to produce those things so that love is received in the church and love is communicated in the church. That's what he's designing the whole letter around. Does that make sense? Which changes the way you read the letter. Because if you just read the letter as like a do's and don'ts list for pastors, it's not helpful. But if you realize he's saying those things to produce purity in Timothy so that there's love in the church, it colors everything that he's saying to Timothy. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, good. All right, good. So there's a couple. So some texts are incredibly crucial to understanding the whole point of the book, like those. Some texts just fit in, and they're just one component and a link of thoughts. Okay? And our job is to summarize so that we have all those things held onto. Before we start to interpret, we get each of those pearls in a line, and then we're able to say, this one says this, and that's connected to this one over here, and that's connected to this one over here, and this is what he's doing in this argument. And when we get that, then we understand the purpose, the author's intent of the writing of the text. Does that all make sense? Which is the goal, right? That's the goal of all of this interpretation. Yeah.
How could so like my Bible has like an intro where it has kind of the point.
Yeah.
Why he's writing it, some context already, like what might be going on while he's writing it.
Yep.
Is this still like applicable in that sense?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that might be historical background information. Like, for example, Paul's in prison when he writes Ephesians, right? But he's writing it to encourage the church at Ephesus. With what? With the realities of the gospel, and then call them to unity and righteousness in the church. So that's just summarize the book right there, right? And that helps you to then outline the book, and then that helps you understand what's happening in his prayer in Ephesians 3:14-19. And when you understand what's happening in his prayer, then you understand exactly what he means in one sentence in that context, and how it fits into each successive size of context. Yeah.
So John, can you take into account, when we're trying to understand the author, take into account the writing skills of these folks?
Yeah.
Paul seems to be highly educated, writes really well,
Yeah.
but some of the disciples are probably not very well educated.
Yeah, you do have to take that a little bit. Yeah. But what we would say is what's communicated in the Bible is God's divine revelation to us. So regardless of the writing skills or the style, the communication is revelatory. So we're taking it as though God were speaking it to us and then analyzing it in that sense. All the way down to the words and grammar, all the way down to like the minutia, it's from God directly. And so because it's from God directly in that sense, different writing styles, really high, hard Greek, easier, simpler Greek. Like 1 John is the easiest Greek in the New Testament. Super easy to read. First-year Greek students do it all the time. You translate 1 John. So what's the first thing you do? First 3 months of Greek. Well, maybe not that fast, but first 6 months of Greek, you can translate 1 John. But it's radically difficult to understand and interpret. So it's easy Greek, but a really hard book, right? So he's a brilliant guy, even though his writing style is very simple and pedantic. So the styles aren't necessarily, they're going to influence a little bit, and they're going to change the way that we interpret it a little bit, but the interpretation itself is born out of a conviction that it's God's word.
I mean, you brought a good example of 1 John, so the wrong conclusion would be the guy just didn't know how to write.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's not the right conclusion, right? The right conclusion is the guy's a genius and he wants everyone everywhere to read it, and he writes it in a simple way so that it's acceptable and understandable for most people. One of the funniest ones, like in terms of Paul and his genius, I love this. Look at Ephesians Chapter 3. I mean, this is intentional, but it's kind of crazy. Like, it's not the way I would have ever communicated. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "For this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles." And then what do you have there? Yeah, like a hyphen, a dash, right? What happens? Well, he actually just goes on this wild tangent. And he's like, if indeed you've heard, blah, 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 and he shoots out on this huge tangent over here. When does he come back? When does he come back to that? Huh? No, earlier than that, but good guess. Yeah, who said 14? Good job, Kiki. Yes. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father. For this reason. How do you know that's where he's back? That for this reason repetition, right? So you have Paul, who is a great writer, who's like, I'm going to pray for these guys. Anyway, I'm going to go over here. And he just wanders into this huge area of the grace of God and how he's a minister of the gospel. It's all this stuff. It's a giant parentheses. It's just a giant parentheses to communicate what's about to come in 14. Okay? Does that make sense? Good? Nod, Kevin. Yes, good. Okay, perfect. Good. Okay, so we're trying to grasp authorial intent, and we're trying to do it by breaking it into pieces, summarizing each piece, and then seeing how the pieces link together and where they fit in the author's argument. Okay? Any questions on any of that? Okay, last two things there. Ultimately, our task as interpreters is to reach the point where we can outline the complete argument of the author from start to finish and then identify our passage within that argument. This works on a global level within the Bible itself and on a local level of the passage itself and its immediate context. See that little circle diagram there? That's in the book. You have the passage, you have its immediate context, you have the rest of the larger section, then you have the rest of that book, and then you have the rest of the Bible. You can even put the rest of the New Testament versus the rest of the Old Testament, but the rest of the Bible, okay? Anyone want to take a stab at summarizing the whole Bible in a single sentence? Just for a little practice. Chris? You hit one out of the park last time. Okay. Yeah, I mean, yes. No, that's good. God's glory displayed through his love, but how is his love displayed? Through the cross. Yeah, in the redemption of sinners through the cross of Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's great. That's a good summary, right? And what the author here is showing us in these circles is that there are like an onion level of those things, and you can get all the way out to the outside, right? When we talk about any text, ultimately any text is about God's glory, and ultimately every text is about the glory of Christ at the cross, and ultimately every text is about redemption and what God has done for sinners. And then we can move inward all the way into the single passage and say, oh, that's what he's saying, and drop out the one meaning of that passage. Does that make sense? All right, you want to try a couple just for fun? We'll do this really quick. It's 3:15. We got plenty of time. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to write a single sentence of some passages, okay? A single sentence. And then if you want bonus points, try to outline what's being said in that passage, okay? So I'll give you a couple. I think I have a dry erase marker. Okay, so let's do First Peter 5, 1 through 4. Do that one. Try to get a single sentence summary, and then try to outline what's being said there. And then do 1 Peter 2, 20 through 24. Okay, try to do that one. We'll take one more. Try to summarize it into a single sentence, and then try to outline it. I wrote them on the board. Then try Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Okay? Huh? No. But see,